Welcome back to Ethical Point. This is the explainer where we take those massive, heavy intersections of philosophy and public service and actually make sense of them. I'm your host, and today we are going to dive headfirst into a classic Socratic dialogue. We're going to look at a fundamental dilemma through two completely different lenses. On one side, we have the natural instinct of the skeptic, or, the student inside all of us, who just really wants to trust their gut. And on the other side, we've got the seasoned wisdom of the mentor, the one who truly understands the heavy, necessary weight of the rulebook. It's a great one today, so let's get right into it.
Okay, to set the stage, let's just drop straight into the deep end with a question pulled directly from the 2023 UPSC General Studies paper IV. It asks, is conscience a more reliable guide when compared to laws, rules, and regulations in the context of ethical decision-making? Now, if you're putting on your student hat right now, your natural urge might be to shout, well, obviously, yes, my gut feeling, my internal morals, surely those matter way more than some dusty old rulebook, right? But as any veteran UPSC evaluator will happily tell you, the real answer requires a whole lot more nuance than that.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with the core debate, then explore when conscience guides us, why laws remain absolutely essential, how to resolve administrative conflicts, how to find that balanced approach, and finally, we'll wrap up with your specific answer writing strategy.
All right, part one, the core debate, pitting internal against external authority. At the very heart of public administration, there's this constant simmering tension. It's the clash between external authority, which means following the strict written rulebook to the letter, and internal authority, which is listening to your own inner voice. The skeptic naturally argues that the rulebook is just way too rigid, while the mentor warns that the inner voice can be completely unpredictable. So let's pause for a second. What exactly is conscience? In layman's terms, it's that little inner voice that lets you judge the moral rightness or wrongness of an action. It's your internal moral compass, and it's built and shaped over time by your values, your upbringing, and a lot of careful reflection. Unlike a law, which basically just tells you the bare minimum you have to do to avoid getting thrown in jail, conscience is what inspires higher ideals. It pushes you toward true compassion and unyielding integrity.
Moving right along to part two, when conscience guides us, or going way beyond the rulebook. To really get where the skeptic is coming from here, we need to unpack two crucial concepts, the spirit of the law and higher moral values. The spirit of the law means acting on the true intent of justice, rather than just obsessing over the literal words printed on a page. And higher moral values? Those are what elevate your behavior way beyond basic legal compliance. Think about a practical, real-world scenario. Imagine a civil servant who spends an extra hour completely off the clock after their shift ends, helping an illiterate citizen fill out complicated forms. There is absolutely no law mandating that extra hour. None. That action is purely 100% driven by higher moral values.
So why does relying on your conscience actually work so well in practice? Well, the truth is, laws are finite. They simply cannot predict every single bizarre, complex human situation that might pop up. So, when the law is silent, or when it's just super ambiguous, you enter what we call an ethical gray area. And in those vacuums, your conscience steps up as a situational guide. It applies empathy and moral sensitivity instead of just a cold, robotic, mechanical reading of a statute. And by doing that, it actually upholds the true spirit of justice.
But conscience does something even more profound when you're faced with unethical laws. Let's pause to define those. Unethical laws are rules that are perfectly valid legally, but they're completely morally bankrupt. Think of historical horrors, things like slavery, apartheid, or systemic racial discrimination. They were legal, right? But it is our inner conscience that builds the moral courage necessary to stand up and reject those laws. It's the conscience that drives brave whistleblowers to expose corruption, completely overriding their natural fear of authority just to protect basic human dignity.
Which brings us to part three, why laws remain essential, the true anchor of governance.
Now, you might be sitting there wondering, well, if conscience is so amazing, why not just run the whole system on it? And the mentor will quickly and rightly warn you, unchecked inner voices can lead to absolute moral anarchy in administration. You literally cannot run a massive country purely on gut feelings. Because conscience is inherently subjective. It changes from person to person based on their culture, their biases, their beliefs. Laws, however, provide objectivity. Let's define that. Objectivity means having uniform standards that prevent arbitrary, random decisions. Plus, laws represent collective wisdom. They aren't just made up over a cup of coffee, they evolve through years of democratic deliberation, judicial interpretation, deep constitutional values, and the shared historical experience of the entire state.
So the absolutely crucial point here boils down to accountability. Without laws, how on earth do we enforce consequences? As our skeptic eventually has to realize, without clear written rules, a person could falsely justify theft or violence or horrific discrimination simply by shrugging and claiming, well, my conscience allowed it. Laws are what protect society from individual biases by clearly and firmly defining our rights and our duties.
Okay, Part 4, Resolving Administrative Conflicts, also known as facing a crisis of conscience. Picture this. You're a public servant sitting at your desk. A desperately poor citizen comes in. They need welfare to survive, like literally survive, but they lack the proper documentation. The law says deny them. Your conscience is screaming, help them. What do you actually do? Well, before you just go rogue and break the rules, you have to beware of moral subjectivism. Let's define that real quick. Moral subjectivism is the massive danger of assuming that your personal internal moral beliefs are universally correct. If you just break the rules and hand over the funds to the undocumented beneficiary, you are acting on moral subjectivism. And while it's super well-intentioned, this opens the door to biased or completely arbitrary decisions that, over time, undermine the entire system of governance.
It's a really delicate balancing act, isn't it? On one hand, we have the serious limitations of conscience. It can be shaped by prejudice, emotional impulses, or just bad information. But on the exact same token, the law has its own glaring limitations. It can be terribly outdated, overly rigid, or entirely insensitive to valid human exceptions. The ultimate takeaway you should lock in here: legality and morality are not always identical.
So what is the actual game plan for our undocumented beneficiary? You want to use this three-step administrative method. Step 1, acknowledge the legal baseline. You simply cannot ignore the law. It exists. Step 2, explore lawful alternatives. Use whatever legal discretion you have available or find alternative welfare programs that they actually do qualify for. And finally, Step 3, recommend policy reforms. Use your official position to fight to change that rigid rule so future beneficiaries don't ever have to face this barrier. By doing this, you avoid a cold mechanical denial, but you also don't break the law.
Now, to actually pull that method off in the real world, you need two very specific tools in your toolkit: reasoned conscience and the mirror test. Reasoned conscience is exactly what it sounds like. It uses the law as the primary framework, but it implements that law with deep empathy. And the mirror test? That asks a brutal, necessary question that every single civil servant must face at some point. If I follow this rule mechanically, can I look at myself in the mirror tomorrow? If the answer is no, then it is your duty to find an ethical interpretation or to formally challenge the rule.
Moving on to Part 5, the balanced approach, harmonizing these two massive pillars.
Look, the debate between the skeptic and the mentor isn't some wrestling match where one side has to defeat the other. It's really all about finding harmony. True ethical decision-making happens exactly in that sweet spot where they reinforce each other. This breakdown makes it crystal clear. Conscience is internal. Laws are external. Conscience enforces its rules through guilt and a loss of personal integrity. Laws enforce theirs through actual legal sanctions. But most importantly, laws set the broad, absolute minimum standards for a functioning society, while your conscience drives your specific, higher ethical aspirations. You absolutely, unequivocally need both.
Finally, Part 6, your UPSC answer writing strategy for scoring that perfect 10 marker.
So, how do we actually translate this fascinating philosophical deep dive into a high-scoring mains answer? Using our trend extrapolator, here is the exact vocabulary and the specific focus areas you need to prep for future case studies. You want to be completely ready to write about the significance of reasoned conscience in Indian administration. Be prepped for case studies where rigid laws clash with conscience, demanding that you uphold those higher moral values. And for sure, do not forget to actively mention applying the mirror test to resolve these tricky administrative dilemmas. Examiners love that.
And for your way forward, or your conclusion paragraph, you want to leave the examiner with a really powerful, perfectly balanced thought. Honestly, you can use this exact framing right here. Conscience and law should not be viewed as competing authorities, but as complementary pillars of ethical conduct. It's brilliant. Laws without conscience just become rigid instruments of injustice, while a conscience without law completely risks moral subjectivity. We have to respect the rule of law while retaining the true moral courage to uphold human dignity.
Which brings us to the end of today's explainer, and before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on. As an aspiring civil servant, you are inevitably going to face a crisis of conscience. It's going to happen. When your deep, personal convictions clash head-on with rigid, unyielding rules, will your reasoned conscience guide you to thoughtfully reform the system from within, or to ethically resist it? Really reflect on what kind of moral courage that takes. Thanks so much for joining me on Ethical Point today, and as always, keep learning. Catch you next time.